So the tradition that we have, however, does have a meaning and a purpose. And I think it has an important meaning and purpose. The work of peace, justice, and freedom is a difficult road to hoe. It's very, for me at least, and many of these people I know, it's very satisfying because you know you're doing the right thing. You're standing up for truth. But the problem is that you don't get rewarded. Oftentimes, the powers to be that control the money and things in society, they don't reward you for being someone who exposes the truth and fights for the right things and freedom. They want to punish you. So these kind of people go against a lot of resistance, and they have to fight an uphill battle to make a difference that for all of us, so we all have a better life. So we'd like to recognize those people at Freedom Law School's banquet dinners for the great efforts that they put forward. And the first person I'd like to recognize is a gentleman who is local to us. He's right here from Orange County, California. And he's in the Merchant Marine. And the man was trying to stand up for what's right and what should be. But they didn't want this man to stand up for what's right and what should be done. They wanted him to shut up. Just be quiet, go along, and get along. Why do you care about all the stuff that's being done wrong? So what with the government? And we're supposed to be the example. We're supposed to be honest. Just do your work, get your job, collect your paycheck, and watch TV. But that was not for him. He spoke out, he did what he could, and kept speaking out about it. And for that, they retaliated against them. And they instituted many false and fraudulent charges and fraudulent legal proceedings to shut him up. And guess what? And it's been a very difficult road, but this man still never gave up hope. He, as difficult as it was, he stood up, he's been fighting them, and he continues to fight them. And we have the honor and the pleasure of recognizing this man this evening. In recognition of your relentless and courageous work to expose government corruption, and for your perseverance in restoring justice, Freedom Law School recognizes you, Lieutenant Eric Shine, as an American Defender of Justice. Come on up, Eric.
I wasn't prepared for this. Nice plaque, too.
That's nice of you.
If you haven't heard my story or what I've been fighting, my name is Lieutenant Eric Shine. I'm a graduate of Kings Point. It's a sister academy to West Point and Annapolis. I come out of Kings Point with a Naval Commission. The Coast Guard, which I'm not in, have not been serving in, has been prosecuting me in a military tribunal for the last 5 years as a civilian. And they've done this to not only deny me JAG counsel that I would get as a naval officer, but they're seizing control of the entire United States Merchant Marine under the auspices of the Coast Guard and coming after me as their first target, I would say. I would use the word victim, but I don't like using that word. At March 1st, 2003, the Coast Guard moved into Department of Homeland Security, and it is declaring itself to be a branch of military. a special branch of military that can violate posse comitatus and carry on military tribunals under Napoleonic law, military law, where you are presumed guilty, has been doing this for the last 5 years, and do this against alleged civilians. So we're pretty far down that slippery slope. I'll be talking a lot about it tomorrow. I'll be speaking from 11.
Good morning.
Yeah, 11:20 to 12:20 or 25.
10:50. 10:50,
Oh.
11:50.
Okay, it's a little earlier than that. Thank you, and I look forward to speaking to you tomorrow. I was not expecting that.
Yes, and you will be hearing more from Eric tomorrow. Ted Gunnison will be our first speaker at 9 o'clock. And around, I think, 10:15 or so, Eric will be speaking about incredible stuff going on, folks. Remember, we're fighting this stuff because one day it's this guy or the other guy or Eric Shine or the people on the trade towers. But, folks, tomorrow it could be us. It could be you. You know, that's why we got to fight for all this stuff. Okay, anybody find our second person back there? No luck? Okay, well, our second person we'd like to recognize, he's not here tonight because apparently he didn't, I don't know, he forgot about the dinner or what, but we have miscommunication happen. Nonetheless, we are going to recognize him because this man has been in the field of writing about the truth, writing what's going on with our government officials for many, many years. And he started doing this as a young man. And he's still not that old. I mean, for someone, I mean, I thought I was one of the few guys that started doing this freedom stuff in his 20s. But he also started in his 20s as well. And he has written for the great freedom paper called Spotlight, which unfortunately, got killed because of corruption. They want to shut him up. The powers to be, the very special, powerful sources, powers out there want to shut him up. They closed Spotlight, but him and other courageous writers and employees of Spotlight formed the great freedom paper, the American Free Press. They did not give up the battle to expose the truth for you, for the freedom-minded people in America like you who still want to know the truth from a trusting, honest newspaper. They kept the battle going and started American Free Press. And I had a pleasure of meeting him several years ago, and my respect for him has grown because when he writes, folks, his stuff is from the sources, his exact quotes. It's all referenced from where it is, not just, a lot of people just say what they want to say. He's a very thorough researcher. And Freedom Law School, in recognition of this man's perseverance to research, discover, expose, and disseminate the truth, recognizes Michael C. Piper as a defender of truth. So would Carla from America Free Press come and accept this on Mike Piper's behalf? Hopefully we'll find him sometime tonight and give it to him, because you heard from him earlier today. Carla is with the American Free Press and Barnes Review that are in Temecula, here in Southern California. Allow to present this to you to give to Mike, please, Carla.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
You don't want me to say anything.
So thank us behalf. Thank you behalf.
I have had the honor and privilege of working for the American Free Press for about 5 years now. It is a fabulous, wonderful organization that is brave and dares to tell the truth. And I think Michael Piper is one of the bravest people I've ever met in my life. So on his behalf, I accept this wonderful award. And thank you. My name is Carla. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Okay, folks, it's time for you to hear the speech that you've been patiently waiting for. This man we brought for you tonight needs really no introduction because he's so well known, so well respected, been at this for a long, long time. Folks, his history is so long, I cannot just repeat it all, but I can just mention a few words about him. He had been involved with many organizations like John Birch Society. He is founder of the Freedom Force International, an organization just a few years old to bring about freedom, not just to America, but the whole world, for the individual to get his rights back from the collectivists, socialists out there who want to take our rights and freedoms away and treat us like slaves. And he is an expert in many areas. He's an expert on New World Order. He is an expert on how the establishment powers that run America and the world, the intricacies of how they work together to control things, the media, the politics, and what goes around us, what we hear and see, how they manipulate us. He's an expert on the field of cancer. He's, in fact, many organizations have him speak on that cancer issue and how the natural alternatives to cancer therapy have been suppressed by the medical establishment. And he's also perhaps the foremost expert and researcher and writer on the field of banking and money. And he's author of the book called The Creature from Jekyll Island, which to my knowledge is the thickest, most comprehensive analysis of banking and Federal Reserve System that exists in the world. And in fact, that is going to be the topic of his speech. The Federal Reserve banking system. How it started, why it started. Well, he's spoken about that issue before, but I've asked him tonight, in addition to that, to add a little bit about, at the end of his speech, before he tells you about Freedom Force International, about where does he see the Federal Reserve and the banking establishment taking America and the world to. And this man, they say, if you know the past, you have a much better understanding of what may happen in the future. So he's going to share us a bit of his insight of what he's coming as well. Please help us. Give a warm hand of welcome to your banquet speaker tonight, Mr. G. Edward Griffin.
Wow, a standing ovation before I even speak. That's probably at the end. I don't expect this. Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, Paymon. That's a very kind introduction. It made me flinch a little bit when you kept calling me an expert, because I think maybe many of you have heard the definition of an expert. X is an algebraic expression for an unknown quantity, and a spurt is a drip under pressure. Well, no more comment on that. My friends advised me that when I give a serious topic presentation like this tonight, that I should always start with a bit of levity, a little joke. And I think, well, what kind of a joke could I tie in with Federal Reserve and money? Oh, I thought of a joke, a money joke. The gentleman but died unexpectedly, and the insurance agent came to his home to deliver the check. The face value of the insurance policy was being paid to his widow, and he showed up and he said, "Ma'am, I'm very sorry to hear of your loss, but maybe this check will be of some comfort to you." And she was wiping her tears away, and she looked at the check, and her eyes got really big because she looked at all those zeros on this check. And she looked up at the insurance agent and she said, "You know, you may find this hard to believe, but I'd give half of this just to have him back again." Takes a second to creep in, doesn't it? Okay, my topic, the Federal Reserve System, the creature from Jekyll Island. Actually, I have another title for this topic that is not very well known. It's called Appearances of the Fourth Kind. How many of you have heard my talk on this topic before? Would you please raise your hand? Oh, that's not as bad as I thought. That's a relatively small group, because I thought I'd be just saying the same thing over again, when I will be for you folks, so I apologize for that. But at least it's
Excuse me.
yes?
A little tighter, so we can hear you. We're up full, so you can talk real close to the mic here. We'd be appreciated. So we can hear you a little bit better.
Okay, you having trouble hearing me back there? What? Of course. All right, thank you. All right. I'll try and get real close to this.
Beautiful.
All right.
Thank you so much.
But I'm reminded of years ago when my children were very, very small. I would read them or tell them bedtime stories, and they loved it. I guess all kids do. But I noticed that if I ever left a part out, I told them the same stories over and over and over again, you know. If I ever left a part out, they'd say, "Oh, wait a minute, Dad, you forgot the part about," and then they'd, you know, instruct me on how to tell the story. Didn't make any difference. They wanted to hear the story again and again and again. So if I leave any parts out, those of you who have heard this before, just raise your hand and tell me what it is I left out, okay? All right, appearances of the fourth kind. I'd like to start this topic by going back in history a bit, in fact, quite a bit, to the 1st century BC. There was an obscure philosopher that lived in the tiny kingdom of Phrygia. You really have to get into the encyclopedia to find out where that was. But that's where he lived, 1st century BC, and his name was Epictetus. And it was Epictetus who said, "Appearances are of 4 kinds. Things either are as they appear to be, or they neither are nor appear to be. Or they are, but do not appear to be, or they are not, and yet appear to be." Everybody got that? Confusing, isn't it? It actually is a very simple concept, but by the time Epictetus got through with it, it's pretty hard to figure out what he was talking about. All he was saying is that appearances are of 4 kinds. Things either are or they aren't. That's 2 of them. And regardless of which, they can sometimes appear to be the opposite. And there are the 4. Why didn't he say so?
He was Greek.
He was Greek, yeah. Well, I figured out that if Epictetus were living today, he'd probably be a Harvard professor teaching banking theory and money and that sort of thing. Or possibly, 9/11, yes. Or possibly he'd be the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, explaining all of these complicated monetary issues to the common American person. I thought, though, that Epictetus's attempt at explaining something simple and making it complicated was worthy of note, because I'd like to focus on that last part of his dissection of reality, appearances of the 4th kind. I'd like to use that as my punctuation point as I go through this presentation, and I think you'll see over and over and over again, even if I forget to remind you, that certainly that is what the Federal Reserve System is, an appearance of the 4th kind, which, as I'm sure you'll remember, are those things that are not and yet appear to be. In other words, great deception. The best place to begin this story, I believe, is where the action is kind of dramatic, and that is Jekyll Island itself. Many people who have not read my book, that's most people, of course, wonder why I chose that title, The Creature from Jekyll Island, for a book about the Federal Reserve System. And I have to admit, I had kind of a little fun with that title in the beginning because it does have a mysterious sound to it. Maybe people would see it in a bookshop window and say, I wonder if that's a sequel to Jurassic Park or something like that. But anyway, the book title really has a definite meaning because it was on Jekyll Island, which is a real island off the coast of Georgia, that the Federal Reserve System was created in the year 1910. And when I discovered that fact early on in my research, I was very fascinated by this fact that something that I used to think was a government agency, and as you'll see as we go along, it is not a government agency, but I thought it was, and I thought something as important as our banking system, which was so intimately tied in with the power of government, surely would have been created in Washington, D.C. Why on a little island off the coast of Georgia? And then I discovered as I dug deeper into it that not only was it done there, but it was done under conditions of extreme secrecy. I'm here to tell you that very few wars of history were ever plotted under conditions of more secrecy than this, which I'll describe for you in just a minute. And then I began to think, when things are done in secret, usually there's something to hide. And so I became obsessed with the question, what is it that these men were trying to hide that they went to such great lengths to go to Jekyll Island? And the more I dug, the more amazed I became, and the more the story began to go together in my mind. And I realized that my job, if it were possible for me to do it, was to write the story in the way in which it really is. In other words, not as a textbook, not as an instruction manual on how to figure out what the discount rate is and how the banks cleared checks and how the balances are all cleared out on their books and all of this stuff that's technical. I realized I was writing a whodunit. I discovered that this was a whodunit story. I figured out who did it and how they did it and where they buried the body and what their motives were. And so that's how I tried to write the book, and that is exactly the way the real world is. So let's take a look at this story, Jekyll Island. It was November of 1910 when Senator Nelson Aldrich sent his private railroad car to the New Jersey Railroad Station, where it was held in readiness, awaiting the arrival of himself and 6 other men who were told to come under conditions of secrecy. They were told not to be seen together as they went to the railroad station, not to dine together, not to tell anybody, really, except maybe the closest persons in their family, where they were going, and certainly not even to tell them why they were going. One of the men carried a shotgun in a big black case for the purpose of, if he had been stopped by a newspaper reporter and asked where he was going, he was prepared to say he was going on a duck hunting trip. And we find out later from the memoirs of one of his children that this man didn't even own that gun. He never fired a shotgun in his life. It was a borrowed weapon simply for the purpose of deception. The issue of newspaper reporters was very important because, you see, in those days, all of the dignitaries, all the politicians and the celebrities traveled by train, and if you wanted to catch an interview or a photograph of one of these people, the best place to do it was at the train depot. And there were always newspaper reporters and photographers hanging out at the Hoboken train depot. And so they were instructed to avoid those paparazzi at all costs. After the men got on board this private railroad car, now remember, a private railroad car in those days would be the equivalent of a private Boeing, I suppose, today, probably more than a Learjet. They were told that when they got on board, they were to continue the conditions of secrecy. They were instructed not to address each other by their last names. They were told to address each other by first names only. And in the case of two of these men, they dropped their first names completely and adopted code names. And they spoke to each other in terms of code names. And I thought, boy, that is really strange. And then we find out from the writings of one of these men who wrote about it years later, he said that the purpose of that was so that the servants on board the railroad car would not know the names of all of the participants. Obviously, they knew the name of Senator Nelson Aldrich. They were employed by him. And they might have known the names of one or two of the others, but not all. And it was the list of all of these names together. These were very powerful and influential and well-known men. If that had been known and had been leaked by the servants, if they had just talked about it, it might have gone from one person to another person, and the first thing you know, it would have been in the newspapers, and it could have completely defeated the purpose of this meeting. Once on board the train, they traveled for 2 nights and a day. I'm sure they were discussing their ultimate plans all the way along. And when they awoke the next morning, they were at Brunswick, Georgia, at a siding. They got off the train, and they were taken by ferry boat across the inland straits to Jekyll Island. Jekyll Island in those days was owned by a very small group of billionaires from New York. It was a private island. It was a resort club. It was where the families of the very, very wealthy went to escape the cold winter months of New York. They had beautiful cottages, they called them. You can visit Jekyll Island today, and you can see that these so-called cottages were really mansions, and you can get an idea of the great architecture of that period. But the showcase of the whole island was the clubhouse, and it too is still standing. You can visit there today. You don't have to take a ferry boat. They now have a bridge. You can drive across it. But the clubhouse was a beautiful wooden structure. It's very well preserved today. And it was in that clubhouse that the men went and sat around a little table in one of the little rooms and cranked out all the details of the Federal Reserve System. By the way, they also relieved all the servants at the clubhouse and had brought in a new crew, temporary employees, to serve this group, again, for the purpose of not being able to recognize and therefore talk about the attendees. If you visit the island today, and I highly recommend it, don't miss the main attraction. On the main floor, as you're going out what you would probably call the back door, it's a little narrow hallway, and just before you step outside, turn to your left, and there's a door, and on the door, there's a plaque. And it says, in this room in 1910, the Federal Reserve was created. And you go into the room, and there's the table, probably not the same table, but one very much like it, a bunch of chairs sitting around it, and pictures of the men on the wall. What I'm telling you is not secret, it's just not well known. I went to the research facilities of the island. They had a librarian there. She was a wonderful lady. She was more than happy to open up all of her filing cabinets and show me photographs and notes and records dating to that meeting and that period. Very helpful. So this is not secret information. I'm not getting this from aliens or anything like that. It comes from the library. Okay, so they sat around that table for a week, and then when they were done, they got back on the train, back in that private railroad car, and I'm sure they were still discussing it on the way back. And then they disappeared into the environs of Wall Street in New York. For many years after that, these men denied, vehemently denied, that they attended such a meeting. Never happened, they said. Gradually, as the word got out and more people began to discuss it, they said, well, yes, we went, but we just went to play some poker and smoke some good cigars as a gentleman's meeting, you know, and do some duck hunting. Finally, after the Federal Reserve Act was passed into law 3 years later in 1913, and even after that, When the American people began to think of the Federal Reserve System as a cherished American tradition or institution, then, and only then, did these men begin to talk openly about their role and what they did there, what they discussed, and what decisions they came to. And after a while, it almost became humorous, because it seemed toward the end of this period that they were competing with each other to convince the readers that they were the most important person at the meeting. And so today, because of their memoirs and because of the biographies that have been written about them by very friendly biographers, I might add, and by the notes of their children and by interviews by newspaper reporters and that sort of thing, you can go to any well-stocked library today and read in minute detail exactly what was on these the minds of these men, and what decisions they made, and what they discussed, and why they came to those decisions. Now, who were these men? The first one I've already mentioned. That was Senator Nelson Aldrich. He was the one who owned the railroad car. He was perhaps the most powerful politician in Washington at the time, second only to the President of the United States, which at that time was Woodrow Wilson. Aldrich was chairman of the National Monetary Commission. That was the special branch of Congress which was given the job of coming up with legislation, proposed legislation, that would be offered to Congress and to the American people as a solution to a big problem in banking. The problem was that Americans were deeply concerned at that time over the concentration of financial power into the hands of a few powerful brokerage firms and banking institutions, insurance companies in Wall Street and in New York. And in those days, they called that the money trust. If you go to the historical records of the time, at the time I was doing research, they didn't have the internet. You had to go down to the Los Angeles Library and get the microfilm out, and you crank through the microfilm and the stuff goes by. And you could read, you could see it in very graphic form on the editorial pages of the New York Times and other newspapers of the period. This phrase kept coming up over and over again, the money trust. And there was a great hue and cry politically to break the grip of the money trust. That was the primary objective of the proposed legislation for the Federal Reserve System, to get those big bad bankers under control of those nice, friendly, wise politicians. They were going to put the politicians to the task and control the bankers. So Senator Aldrich was the chairman of that special committee that was to draft this legislation. Now, you need to know more about him. He was a very wealthy man. He was a business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., okay, which of course made him the grandfather to our former Vice President of the United States, Nelson Rockefeller. You may remember Nelson Rockefeller's middle name was Aldrich. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, and so he was named after his very famous grandfather. The second man on board this train was Abraham Piatt Andrew. He was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He was the only government official on board, and even that is not a correct explanation or description of him, because he was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury because he came from a banking family. He was primarily a banker before he went into Washington as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. So his heart and his loyalties were really with the banks. Interesting person. I don't want to take too much time on these characters, but they're all rich with history. Andrew later became a congressman, but more than that, he represented some of the largest Wall Street investment firms, and he went to Moscow. And this was during that period leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution. And he was instrumental in transmitting huge amounts of money from Wall Street into the coffers of the Bolsheviks. And the plan, as he and others explained it, was simply to buy influence among the Bolsheviks so that when they came to power, they could then close the deal and exploit Russia's natural resources and have some influence over the political Bolsheviks when they came to power. It's a little interesting sideline, but I want you to know that this guy, Abraham Piat Andrew, was not just Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Very important person. Third person on board was Frank Vanderlip. He was the president of the National City Bank of New York, which was one of the big banks, the biggest of all the banks at that time, representing the financial interests of William Rockefeller and Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Henry Davison was on board. Did they land here or something? I just give it a second here. Henry Davison was on board. He was the senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles Norton was there. He was president of the First National Bank of New York, another one of the giants. Benjamin Strong was there. He was head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, and later he became the first actual head of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. And finally, Paul Warburg was there, probably the most important person in terms of knowledge of banking. He was a naturalized American citizen. He was born in Germany. He was a full partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and he was a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. And throughout all of his career in the United States, he maintained a very close business relationship with his brother Max Warburg, who was head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Those were the men that created the Federal Reserve System. But by the way, about Warburg, if there are any Little Orphan Annie fans here, you may remember the character Daddy Warbucks. Well, if you had lived at that time, you would have known that Daddy Warbucks was really an airline pilot. So everybody recognized that Daddy Warbucks was a characterization of Paul Warburg, even his appearance, the bald head and everything else. You don't look like Daddy Warbucks at all. So, and there are a lot of interesting things when you get into these side stories. These men were well known at the time, and they were the subject of cartoons and caricatures. If you remember the game Monopoly, the original artwork in Monopoly, little fat banker with his cigar sitting on the bag of money, that's J.P. Morgan. So it's interesting. Okay, neither here nor there. These are the men who went to Jekyll Island under conditions of great secrecy and created the Federal Reserve System. According to the estimates in the newspapers at the time, these men represented directly through the wealth which they personally controlled, or indirectly through the institutions which they directed, the banking institutions around the world. They represented approximately 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. Now just think about that for a minute. Just the kind of people you would want to break the grip of the money trust. All right. Did it really happen the way I described it? Those of you who are perhaps new to this topic may wonder if maybe I have exaggerated it or embellished the story a little bit to make it interesting. I think I owe it to you to at least show you that I didn't embellish this at all. And I'm going to take a moment and just read an excerpt of an article that was written by Frank Vanderlip. He's one of the participants at this meeting, that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post on February 9, 1935. I remember this is after the Federal Reserve Act was accepted and revered. Now they're talking openly about it. And this is what Frank Vanderlip said. He said, "I do not feel it is an exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We were instructed to come one at a time and as unobtrusively as possible to the railroad terminal on the New Jersey littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness, attached to the rear end of a train to the south. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on last names. We addressed one another as Ben, Paul, Nelson, and Abe. Davison and I adopted even deeper disguises, abandoning our first names. On the theory that we were always right, he became Wilbur and I became Orville. After those two aviation pioneers, the Wright brothers. The servants and train crew may have known the identities of one or two of us, but they did not know all. And it was the names of all printed together that would have made our mysterious journey significant. In Washington, in Wall Street, even in London. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen. End quote. Well, why not? What were they trying to hide? Why shouldn't a group of people get together any place they want to and talk about a banking bill? Even very wealthy and powerful people. Why shouldn't they be able to go to Jekyll Island or any place else? Why is the secrecy? And Vanderlip answers that question himself toward the end of the same article. He said, if it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have had no chance whatsoever of passage by Congress. Of course. Here you have a bill to break the grip of the money trust being written by the money trust? How absurd. And yet that is exactly the strategy that they were using, and they had to keep that concealed from the public, which they did. And which it is still concealed today. There's not one person in 1,000 that knows anything about this history or the motives or the people or anything like that. So, here we had a group of men drafting legislation to limit their own power, supposedly. Right. That's like asking the wolf to build the hen house and guard the chickens, you know. But there's something else. In fact, if you really study that meeting on Jekyll Island and all of the interplay and all of the issues that were discussed there, you really can come away from that little chapter alone with just about everything you need to know today about the Federal Reserve System, because it's all there in its origins. All right, we understand now that the bill was written by the money trust, and therefore didn't stand a chance of ever breaking the grip of the money trust. That was one important thing. Now the other thing is, take a look at the list of these men. Here we got the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Warburgs, Kuhn Loeb and Company, representing Rothschild, and you know, all of these people. Anything strange about that mix? Well, yeah, they're competitors, aren't they? Or they were. These are the firms that prior to this period of history were battling against each other, fighting for dominance in the financial markets of the world. All blood all over the battlefield in Paris and in London and in New York. Fierce competitors. And now they're sitting around a table coming to an agreement of some kind. This is highly instructive because it's precisely at the turn of the century, shortly thereafter, where there was a major shift taking place in how business was done in America. Prior to that period, competition was the norm. And in my opinion, that is the reason the United States grew so rapidly and surpassed the European nations, became more prosperous in a very short period of time, because it was free enterprise competition, while the old world was still struggling under the rules and regulations of granted charters by the crown and special monopolistic privileges, and you had to know somebody to get a permit and all that sort of thing. But at the turn of the century, there was a change. They were going back to the methods of the old world. And some of the historians describe that period as the dawning of the cartel or the monopoly. These men that we were talking about finally came to the position. They said, all right, we are the giants. We are at the top of our fields. Let us not compete anymore. There's no advantage in that. Let us join together and work together to eliminate competition. John D. Rockefeller, all of his biographers quote him on this one. He said, competition is a sin. Why? Well, because somebody might come along and compete and knock him off the top of the hill. Now that he was at the top of the hill, and some of these other business tycoons like Carnegie and so forth, they didn't want competition anymore. And so they struggled for monopolies, and if they couldn't afford a monopoly, they would join with their competitors and create a cartel. I need to define a cartel briefly here so we're all on the same page. A cartel is a group of independent companies, privately owned or separately owned, I should say, that are agreeing not to compete with each other in various ways so that they can improve their profit margins or their position in the marketplace and keep real competitors out. So they agree not to compete on price, for example, or they agree not to compete on geography. They'll say, you can have the North, we'll operate in the South. They may share patents and processes. And in this way, every time they come to another agreement, these agreements layered one on top of the other become thicker and thicker until finally the whole thing is encased. And what you have is an entity which, even though the component parts are independently owned, they move as one insofar as the market or the consumer is concerned, and this, of course, is to their advantage and to the consumer's disadvantage. This was happening in full swing at the point of this meeting on Jekyll Island, and these former competitors came to Jekyll Island for the purpose of creating a cartel, which is exactly what they did. If anyone asks you what the Federal Reserve System is, you're not going to find this answer in the textbooks, but the answer is, it is a cartel. It's no different than a banana cartel, an oil cartel, sugar cartel. It's a banking cartel. It's comprised of the largest firms in the banking industry, not only in the United States, but at its origin at least, there were international interests involved as well. And so they formed a cartel for the purpose of regulating their own members and making sure that upstart competitors did not have a real chance against them. So the Federal Reserve System is a cartel after all. Now we know something else just by studying what happened there on Jekyll Island. But there's more. See, one of the problems that cartels have is to enforce agreement. If you and I were to form a cartel of whatever we're going to do, whatever our mutual business is, we all agree that we're going to charge the same price for chewing gum, let's say. That's our business. Okay, we can all raise the prices, and the public has no choice. If they want chewing gum, they've got to pay the higher price. Now suppose that I decide, no, I don't like that agreement anymore. I think I can make more money by lowering my price and getting a bigger share of the market. What are you going to do about it? Can't do anything about it, legally anyway. I mean, in the real world, they do have guys with the bent nose and the cauliflower ears that come around, and they call them enforcers, but that's generally not how it's done. How do you get all of the members of the cartel to conform? And the answer is, take the cartel agreement and make it into a law. And so all cartels, all monopolists, gravitate toward government. They want government as a partner in their agreements. Once they take their cartel agreement and get it passed through the legislature as a law, now they don't have to worry about people like me dropping out, because I would be violating the law and they'd come and put me in jail. And it's all done for you folks, of course. I became extremely aware of this some years ago when I was looking at these, this cartel that they call the Dairy Association. All of these big dairies were trying to fix their prices up. And the trouble is that some of the small dairies were selling milk cheaper. We can't have that. We can't have people buying milk cheaper than what the cartel decided, and so they went to Washington and they got it passed into a law. It's a fair trade law, I think they called it. Fair trade law. Now the government's going to protect everybody and make sure that the prices are fixed across the board so everybody can afford milk, so that babies won't be denied milk. And it was sold to the people as a great humanitarian measure, but the net effect was it raised the price of milk for everybody. This is how it works. So you got to keep this in mind when you're looking at Jekyll Island. These men created a cartel and they went into partnership with the federal government so that none of the banks themselves or even the smaller ones that are coming along in the future could ever drop out of the cartel agreement. Okay. We learn all of that just by studying Jekyll Island. Reminds me of when I was a kid. We used to listen to the train whistles and think that was a beautiful sound. This is not a beautiful sound. Okay. So now let's go back and leave Jekyll Island for a moment and ask some rather functional questions. Why did the banks and why did the government form this partnership? What's in it for them? You know, when people go into a partnership, there's usually something of benefit to both partners or they wouldn't do it. So let's take a look at that. And in order to answer that question, we have to examine how money is created in America and in most of the world today. I call this the Mandrake mechanism because when I was a boy, in the 1940s, I guess it was, there was a comic book character by the name of Mandrake the Magician. He was quite a guy, had this big cape, velvet cape, and he could whip the cape around, and things would materialize just out of thin air. And then he could whip it again, and it would disappear, poof, be gone. And as I got to studying how the Federal Reserve System creates money, I thought, my gosh, Mandrake was here. So I call this the Mandrake mechanism. It does enable the banks to create money out of nothing and to cause it to disappear back into nothing. Now, let's see how this process works. Of the two partners, government and the banks, let's start with the government because that's a little simpler to see. Here's how it works. The Congress likes to spend money, lots and lots of money, because that makes them popular. They get elected by giving away benefits and doing all these wonderful things. So spending money is kind of an important thing for politicians. But raising taxes in order to pay for these benefits is not a popular thing. And so politicians always have this dilemma of how to spend more money without increasing taxes. If you're a politician, this is no problem whatsoever. You just borrow it like anybody else might borrow it. If you want to spend more than you take in, you borrow it, and then you can spend it for a while, at least. At the private side of the equation of people like you and me, we can only do that up to a point, and then we run out of credit and we lose our property. Politicians don't have that little problem because they can just keep creating it and creating it, increasing the national debt and so forth, and they never expect to pay it back. It never crosses their mind. They just know that in their dark little hearts, they're going to keep creating money, borrowing money, expending and spending it until the economy collapses, and then they'll say, golly, I wonder how that happened. And then they'll start all over again, and everybody will be bankrupt. But anyway, let's keep it simple. The politicians want more money, and so they borrow it. How do they borrow it? Well, the first step is to go to the private investor, like us, or to investment funds or banks or even other countries, corporations. You know, all the people have money that they want to loan to the government because they are quite sure they're going to get it back plus interest. And they don't think it all the way through, I'm afraid, but they have this, they've heard this expression that, you know, it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. And that makes everybody feel kind of good inside. That's about as sound an investment as you can make. What they don't realize is that this phrase has a meaning. When you hear somebody say that's it, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, that means the United States government promises to pay that money back to you plus interest. If it's got to take everything from you you have in taxes to do it, it will do it. That's exactly how they're going to do it. They're going to get it from you. Reminds me of this. This speech is going to be too long, but I got to tell you this story. Things keep popping into my head. Like the hunter was stranded out there in the wilderness and ran out of food, and his dog was starving. He was starving. The dog was whimpering. And so finally the hunter took a knife and cut off the dog's tail, and he fed it to the dog, and the dog licked his master's hand in gratitude for the meal. This is what's going on with government benefits and all of that sort of thing. All right, so the politicians need more money. We're back on that track. So they go to the private sector and they borrow it plus interest. Well, 30 days later when the bond or the note is due, or 90 days later, or a year later, or 5 years later, whatever the term of the note is, lo and behold, the congressmen still are not collecting enough taxes to cover their expenses. They're still running in the red. So how do they pay back that original loan?
New bonds.
No problem, new bonds. We just sell some more bonds, only this time more, enough to cover the interest, and a little bit more to cover the expanded expenditure program too. So every year you see this rising national debt. Everybody understands that. But here's where it gets a little tricky. There's never enough money in the private sector to supply all of the borrowing needs of the government. They always run a little short at the interest rates they're willing to pay. Now, if they raise the interest rates, of course, then they could get all the money they want. But they're trying to play that balance. So there's a shortfall. Now what? Here's where the Federal Reserve comes in. Let's just mentally imagine that the Secretary of the Treasury walks into the Federal Reserve building, and he says, the President of the Federal Reserve says, "Come in, sir, we've been expecting you. We know you're here for a loan," because he goes there every day. And the Treasury official says, "Yes, I'm here for a loan." And the Federal Reserve officer says, "Well, how much would you like today?" And the Treasury official said, "Oh, another $1 billion would probably cover us until noon tomorrow." And he said, "No problem." Now, bear in mind what I'm describing now is figuratively speaking. This is really all done in computers. But let's just imagine that the Federal Reserve officer opens up the desk drawer, pulls out this big black book, checkbook, and he writes a check to the United States government for $1 billion, signs it, hands it over. The deal is done. The Treasury official says, "Thank you very much." On his way out, he deposits it into the account of the federal government, and now the federal government has another $1 billion. Just like that. Everybody's happy. Now the question, though, is where did that $1 billion come from? Who put it into the account? Who invested it in there? What account, as a matter of fact? It turns out there's no account. There's no money in there. It's just created. It's just a bad check is all it is. But nobody's allowed to call it a bad check because it's legalized by the Federal Reserve Act. If you and I were to do it, we would go to jail. But the Federal Reserve can do it because Congress wants them to do it. You see, this is a beautiful source of any amount of money on a heartbeat. Anytime they really need money, in spite of all of this talk about, oh, we're running out of money, when it comes push to shove, like bailing out the banks that you've been reading about last week, where do you think that money comes from? Thin air. The government can create it anytime it wants, or I shouldn't say the government, they can go to their partner, the Federal Reserve System, which creates it out of thin air anytime the government needs it and then gives it to the government, supposedly as a loan, but they're not loaning anything. They just created it. It's an act of creation, not an act of loaning. You see, it's the same thing as if the government simply turned on the printing presses and printed paper bills. But they do it through the banking system to make it a little more mysterious so the average person says, I don't get it. How do they do that? That's the whole idea. All right, so now that's why the politicians are in the partnership, because it's a very convenient and reassuring way to know that they can get any amount of money at an instant notice anytime they need it. Why are the banks in it? Well, if you think the action so far is, if you think the action so far is interesting, well, you get to this side of it. Now, let's just imagine that this $1 billion that the Federal Reserve created out of thin air and gave to the government, let's follow $1,000 of it that winds up in a check given to a postal worker working for the federal government. Now he's got a $1,000 check. And he looks at this and he would never dream that that money didn't exist anywhere in the universe a day before. And he wouldn't care anyway because it's spendable now. It's a government check backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. So he takes it down to his local bank, deposits it into his private checking account, and now the money is out of the government side of this and into the banking private sector, or the private banking sector, I should say, and this is where the action heats up. Let's imagine that I am the president of this bank that just got the $1,000 deposit. If you folks were all in my bank, I'd be able to open my window and say, attention everybody, I have some good news. This gentleman over here just deposited $1,000 in our venerable bank, and that is good news. And most people would say, yes, it is very good news, because they know that if there's money deposited into the bank, then the bank has money to loan. And a lot of people are in the bank, believe it or not, to borrow money, not to put it in, but to take it out. So everybody's happy that there's money to loan, because they know that generally the more money there is to loan, the lower the interest rates and all that sort of thing. But let's suppose that you, Payman, you say, well, yeah, but $1,000 is not going to cut it. You know, I'm looking at this this used car that I'd like to pick up for $9,000, and I guess you can't lend me $9,000. You've only got $1,000. And if I were a good banker, I'd say, oh, of course, don't worry about it. I can loan you $9,000. And Payman, knowing you as I do, you'd say, well, how can you do that? And I'd say, don't worry about it. It's all legal. It's the Federal Reserve's taking care of it. You should go to school and learn about these things, but we don't have time to talk about it today. And it turns out that, yes, I'm right. I can, as a banker, loan $9,000 to you based on his $1,000 deposit. It's all very simple. You see, the Federal Reserve says that the banks have to keep 10% of all their loans in deposit, in reserve. So all of their loans that are out there have to be backed by 10% in reserve. So I, as a smart banker, I get a piece of paper out there and I write across the top of the ledger, reserve, and I enter $1,000. Okay, let's see, $1,000 is 10% of what? Oh, $10,000. So that means I can loan $9,000 and still have 10% reserve, can I? Because I put the reserve in first. So now I can create the money out of thin air and loan it to you, Payman. And I've complied with my requirement through the Federal Reserve because I have 10% in reserve. And believe it or not, that's a little oversimplification, but that's the fundamental mechanism by which money comes into being in America. For every $1 billion created out of thin air to loan to the federal government, up to an additional $9 billion more is created out of the same thin air in order to loan to you and to me and to corporations and all of the private sector that borrows money. This is how money comes into being, and this is why the banks are in it. Well, why are the banks in it? Important point, because you see, when the federal government gets that money out of thin air, it uses it for its own expenditures. But when the banks create the money out of thin air, they don't use it for their purposes. They don't use it to build their buildings and so forth or pay their employees. They use it to give to you folks. But they collect interest on it, don't they? Think about that. Interest on nothing. It's a fantastic deal. It's a fantastic deal. Why didn't I think of that? You know? This is why the banks are in it. When the banks tell you they're making only 2 or 2.5% on your deposits, they're not telling you the whole story. By the time they add in the interest they're making on nothing, now their interest figure goes up by at least a factor of 9. At least that. And in some cases even more, because they have ways of rotating this in and out and working on the float. All right. Now we see why these partners are in the deal, and you see where it pays to know something about the banking industry, because if you don't know about this, you're going to be taken for one heck of a ride. What ride? Actions have consequences. Does it really affect us? Do we care? Or are we going to sit back and say, well, those bankers are pretty smart guys. I guess they really deserve what they earn. I mean, why didn't we think of that? Maybe I should become a banker, and all this sort of thing. Doesn't affect me. Oh, yes, it does. Let's see how it affects you. When this money is created out of nothing, the money supply expands. It expands at a rate greater than the expansion of goods and services. Now, if they expanded at the same rate, then purchasing power would remain the same. But every time in history, this is not new, every time in history that you give a group of people, politicians or bankers or a cabal of the two in a partnership, give people the ability and the power to create money out of nothing, you know what they're going to do? They're going to create money out of nothing, and they're going to create a lot of it, and a lot more of it, and more of it, and more of it, until finally goods and services are going up like this, but money is going up like this. And that discrepancy between the money supply and the value that's underneath it is what we call inflation. Prices appear to be going up, especially now. You might have noticed. And I say appear to be going up because they're not really. Prices are not going up. What's happening is that the value of the dollar is going down. That's the real equation. And you can best see that by taking a look at what a gold coin would have purchased in ancient Rome. Had we lived in ancient Rome and we had a 1 ounce gold coin, we could have been able to buy with it a nice toga, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of sandals. It's about the price. Today, if we've got a 1 ounce gold coin, a cougaran or something with no particular numismatic value, just 1 ounce of gold, and you take it to a bank and cash it in, or take it to a coin store and cash it in real fast, and then run down to the store before it loses its value, with what you get for that coin, you can buy a nice suit, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of shoes. The price of these things hasn't changed in thousands of years when based upon something of tangible value. The reason for that is if your money is based on something like gold or silver or whatever, it takes human effort to produce that gold and silver, pull it out of the earth. It takes human effort and time. And that human effort is matched against the human effort that's being swapped for a suit, handcrafted belt, a pair of shoes, an automobile, or anything else. Everything takes human effort, so it tends to balance out. But once you break that connection between human effort as a basis for money, then the game is over. That means you're going to be robbed. All of your purchasing power, ladies and gentlemen, is being taken from you through this process that we call inflation. I did the chart on it. You'll find it in my book. Over a period of 70 years, the normal, let's say the lifespan, or at least certainly the working lifespan of the average human being, the government and the banks are going to confiscate over 90% of your wealth through the process of inflation. And in today's world, it's probably going to take less than 70 years. That is the consequence of the Federal Reserve System. All right. Let's go back to Jekyll Island, We're not done there yet. One of the things they had to do there is choose a name. You see, what they were creating was originated really in Europe in the 16th century. They were doing a pretty close rip-off, at least an imitation, of the Bank of England, which was formed in 1694. What we have here, the Federal Reserve System, was modeled directly after the Bank of England, and that's where Paul Warburg came in, because he and his European connections knew European banking better than anybody. In America, the politicians in Washington had heard about this system, and it has a name. It's called a central bank. It doesn't really mean anything, but if you want to look up the structure of what we're talking about, the Federal Reserve System, and in other countries a similar structure, you look it up in the index of any encyclopedia or any textbook on this topic, and the name is a central bank. So the Bank of England was a central bank, and these men on Jekyll Island were determined to create a central bank in America. Okay? But the politicians in Washington had heard the phrase central bank. And they said, we don't want a central bank. They didn't know what it meant, but they knew that the word existed. And they said, look, America is special. We have our own unique customs, our own traditions. We're America. We're not Europe. We don't want to have what they have over there in Europe. We don't want a central bank. That was the mood. That was the opinion in Washington at the time. So one of the things they discussed on Jekyll Island is what to call this central bank they were creating, so that the American people wouldn't know that it was a central bank. And they gave it some thought, and they came up with this. They said, look, let's call it federal. If we put the word federal to it, that makes it sound like it's got something to do with the federal government. We'll put the word reserve in there, because that makes it sound like we've actually got reserves, which they don't. And they put the word system in. Now that was more important then than you might think. It certainly means nothing today. But remember, in those days, the American people were concerned over the concentration of financial power in New York. And so what they wanted was a diffusion of power across the land. They wanted to see these mausoleum buildings they called the Federal Reserve Banks, so-called, springing up in Chicago and San Francisco and all over the United States. They wanted a system to convince the gum-chewing public that they had a diffusion of power. And so the word system was very important in those days. And of course they added the word bank to it, and in every case, ladies and gentlemen, it was an appearance of the fourth kind, because it wasn't federal any more than Federal Express. There are no reserves behind it to be of any value. It's not a system. Full concentration remains with the big banks in New York, and it's not a bank. So if you're looking for a perfect example of an appearance of the fourth kind, you're not going to find any better one than this. All right. The next step was to sell this creature to the American public. It was introduced first as the Aldrich Bill, for obvious reasons. Senator Aldrich was the chairman of the Monetary Commission. Paul Warburg wrote to him and said, look, Nelson, don't do this. Don't put your name on this bill, because your name is so well identified with the big bankers. And people will say this is a bill of the big bankers. And I guess Aldrich was so egotistical, he must have said, I never saw anything in writing from him, but we know what happened. So I can picture Aldrich saying, well, after all, I am the chairman of the Senate Monetary Commission, and I'm well respected, and it is my bill, and people will certainly be impressed because my name is on it. Well, it turns out that Warburg was right. The minute the bill came out, everybody was saying it was a bill of the big bankers, and it had very little support in Congress. That was just, this one's coming low. It was no big deal. They simply sent the bill back. They took Aldrich's name off. And you see, he was known as a Republican, and everybody knew in those days that Republicans were all wealthy and big businessmen. So they found two Democrats, and they put their name on it. And that was Carter Glass and Robert Owen. It was now the Glass-Owen bill. And they were Democrats. Now that's different because Democrats, you know, are hardworking people, and you know, they represent the working class, guys with dirt under their fingernails, you know, like Ted Kennedy. And nobody seemed to notice that Owen was a banker. That didn't make any difference. Images are all that count in Washington, and unfortunately, to a large extent, among the voters, too. So the image now, this was a working man's bill, it was the people's bill, and so that was another example of an appearance of the fourth kind. All they did was just scramble the paragraphs around a little bit and change the names on the cover. The next thing was to build some kind of a scholarly background for it. These large firms began to make fairly sizable donations to some of the great universities in America, especially those that did not have departments of economics or were underfunded in their departments of economics. So they would make large grants, and they would say, well, we're happy to give you this $1 million or $5 million, but would you mind if you give us the privilege of appointing the chairman of the economics department? And of course, the presidents of the universities and the board of directors would say, of course not. Thank you for the $5 million. So it turned out very quickly that they salted some of the large universities with new departments of economics, and in every case, the chairmen of the departments were handpicked by these bankers, and of course they began to write scholarly tomes about the wonders of the Federal Reserve System and how great it would be for America. The next step was to create the illusion of popular support. They began to form little ad hoc committees. Little groups would spring up like the Cincinnati Committee for Honest Money or Banking Reform, the Detroit Committee for Banking Reform. And it just looked like grassroots was happening everywhere. But when you looked at these organizations, they were usually a one-man organization, and they were employed by somebody in this banking circle. They were being paid to do this. But nevertheless, they would write letters to the editor, and they'd sign their name as the president of the Detroit Banking Committee and so forth. So they created this appearance of a broad, popular, grassroots support, which was an appearance of the fourth kind. All right. Finally, the last obstacle was a senator by the name of William Jennings Bryan. Now he was, as I'm sure most of you know, he was the head of what they called the populist movement in those days. The populist movement didn't have any well-defined principles, except it was all for the working man. It was we the people sort of thing. And William Jennings Bryan was a great orator and a very powerful personality, and he was accepted as their leader. Without his support, the Federal Reserve System probably would not have been passed, and he was opposed to it. Why? He didn't like the fact that these banks would be able to create money out of nothing. I wonder where he got that idea. And he said so. So how to win over Bryan became the next major step. And the answer again came from Warburg, who was always the strategist. Warburg said, give Bryan what he wants. If he doesn't like that feature of the Federal Reserve, that we can create money out of nothing, then strike it from the bill. And the other guy said to Warburg, they said, well, wait a minute, Paul, wait a minute, this is our bill. We want that. We need that provision in there. And Warburg's answer was brilliant. He said, gentlemen, we can fix it up later. Our object is to get the bill passed. We can fix it up later. So they followed that advice. They struck those provisions from the original act or the ones that were particularly offensive to Bryan, Bryan said, oh, well, now that you've done that, I guess I can support the bill. And he did. The bill was passed, and they did indeed fix it up later. Since the bill was passed, there have since been over 100 amendments to it, and every feature that Bryan objected to, plus hundreds more that he would never have dreamed, have been passed. In fact, I think that the original founders never dreamed that the Federal Reserve System would have such far-reaching, unrestrained power as it does today to create money literally out of anything. I think if you went to the Federal Reserve System today and you had an IOU on a napkin, they'd say accepted, and loan you 9 to 1 on it. Anyway, so they did fix it up later, and so that was another appearance of the fourth kind. All right, let's step back from this creature now and see what we got. We got a corporation chartered by Congress. It was given the exclusive franchise to create the nation's money supply. Think about that. The banks can create, and do create, the nation's money supply. Secondly, we got a banking cartel that became a partner with the federal government to enforce its cartel agreement and to create the illusion of being a public agency. We got a mechanism whereby Congress has been able to raise unlimited taxes from the American people through a process called inflation. And the American people don't even know they're paying the tax. I read in the paper the other day there are a lot of truckers now going to go on strike because the price of gasoline is getting up to $4 a gallon. They're going to go on strike because the price of gasoline is going up. I don't hear any of those guys saying it's the Federal Reserve System that's doing it. People don't have any idea that they're paying taxes through inflation. Pretty cool. And finally, we got a mechanism whereby the banks can collect interest on nothing. Now there, ladies and gentlemen, is an overview of the Federal Reserve System that you will not find in any textbook in American schools. But that is the reality. What are the objectives of the Federal Reserve System? Why was it created? Well, the myth is perpetuated in all of our textbooks. One of the best known ones is written by Paul Samuelson. You find this in all the schools. And in there, Samuelson explains why the Federal Reserve was created. He says, quote, "The Federal Reserve sprang from the panic of 1907 with its alarming epidemic of bank failures. The country was fed up once and for all with the anarchy of unstable private banking." Okay, that's what he says. That's what the kids learn. Let's leave it at that and take a look at how well the Federal Reserve has done in its mission. Let's give it a report card. If that's its mission, let's see how well it's done. Since 1913, when it was enacted into law, the Federal Reserve has presided over the crashes of 1921 and 1929, the Great Depression of 29 through 39, recessions in the years 53, 57, 69, 75, and 81, a stock market Black Monday in 87, Mr. Toad's wild ride in the stock market since the fall of 1998, a complete meltdown of the dollar happening right now in 2008, corporate debt is soaring, personal debt is greater than ever, both businesses and personal bankruptcies are at an all-time high, banks and savings and loans have failed in larger numbers than ever before, interest on the national debt is consuming half of our tax dollars, interest on consumer debt has driven the average personal savings rate into a negative range, and although income has risen each year in terms of dollars, real purchasing power for the middle class has been dropping steadily for over 35 years. The national debt is about $7 trillion and in a vertical climb. Inflation since 1913 has been well over 1,000%, and it has taken more than 90% of the purchasing power of the American people in that time. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is the scoreboard or the report card that the Federal Reserve System gets after 95 years of stabilizing the economy. It flunks. Of course it flunks. Why? Why has it failed these objectives? Because those were never the real objectives at all. Duh. No, that's for you to believe. That's what they say. Would you ever support the Federal Reserve System if Bernanke or anybody comes from the Federal Reserve and says, well, we raised interest rates today because we want to make some more money for the banks? That would go over like a lead balloon. He's always got to say, well, we're going to stabilize the economy, we're going to cool off inflation, or we're going to stimulate employment, or something for you folks. That's how they have to do it. What are the real objectives of the Federal Reserve System? These are not hard to discern because they talked about them at Jekyll Island. Here they are. Stop the erosion of the monetary control from the larger banks in New York. That was number one. At this time in history, there were banks opening up in the South and in the West, and commerce was moving away from New York. They still had the lion's share in Washington, in New York, but they realized that they had to do something to maintain control there. And so that was number one objective of the Federal Reserve, is to put controls on the system so that it will always remain in New York. Number two, to reverse the trend of industrial expansion by private capital formation. Now that's one of those phrases. What does private capital formation mean? It merely means that in those days, if you can imagine, people were tending to save money. Instead of a corporation going to the bank and borrowing money for a big expansion program, they would create a little nest egg. Every quarter, when it was time to pay dividends, they would hold back a little bit from their stockholders, put it into a special fund, and after a couple of years, they had their own money. They created their own capital to do their R&R and their expansion programs. And the banks were very concerned about that. And they said, we must figure out a way to bring industry back into the banks for capital. So the enemy was private capital formation. And then, of course, they wanted to pass on the inevitable losses to the taxpayer in the name of protecting the public. I'd like to go back to that private capital formation issue again because this is so important. You see, in those days, how shall I say this? The only way that the banks could get industry or borrowers of any kind into the banks to borrow money more than they were is to lower the interest rates. That's pretty simple arithmetic. And a person might say, well, why didn't they just lower the interest rates then? And the answer is because they couldn't. In those days, money was not created out of nothing. It was based on gold and silver. And there was a limited quantity. And there was a natural interest rate. Those who held the gold or the silver were not going to lend it out because it was all they had. It was valuable. They didn't want to lose it unless they got a certain amount of interest on it. The natural interest rate that many commentators believe is about 3 or 3.25%. And the banks wanted to go below the national interest rate to entice people not to do private capital formation. But they couldn't because that was the natural interest rate. So they began to talk about a flexible currency. They said, what we need is a flexible currency. What does that mean? That doesn't mean money that bends. That means flexible currency in their terminology meant money created out of nothing. They said, well, you know, the farmers need more money in the springtime and the industrial cities need more money in the fall. We want the ability to be flexible so we can create the money for you folks to follow the seasonal trends. And therefore, please give us the power to create money out of nothing to help you. That was the argument. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out. If you can create money out of nothing, you don't need to charge an awful lot of interest on it to show a profit.
The creation itself is a windfall.
That's it. That was the whole hue and cry for the flexible currency, to show a profit on nothing. Those were the three objectives. as stated by these people, not only on Jekyll Island, but in their private papers around that period of time. So let's issue another report card. How has it really done when we have the real objectives in front of us? Did it keep control with the larger banks? And the answer is a resounding yes. One of the better known books out there today on the Federal Reserve System is written by William Grider. It's called Secrets of the Temple. And it was published by Simon & Schuster. Even people who disagree with what I am saying about the Federal Reserve generally cite this book as an authority. And this is what William Grider says about this issue. He says, at the time, the conventional wisdom in Congress was that the government institution would finally harness the money trust. There's that phrase again. Disarm its powers and establish broad democratic control over money and credit. The results were nearly the opposite. The money reforms enacted in 1913, in fact, helped to preserve the status quo, to stabilize the old order. Money center bankers would not only gain dominance over the new central bank, but would also enjoy new insulation against instability and their own decline. Once the Fed was in operation, the steady diffusion of financial power halted. Wall Street maintained its dominant position and even enhanced it. Yes, just look around you. You can see the New York banks have total control over the system and always have. I'd like to comment on this book. When I heard about Secrets of the Temple, I was nearing the end of writing my own book. I'd spent a lot of time researching this bloody thing, and I saw, oh my gosh, Simon & Schuster beat me to it, and it was touted as a great expose of the Federal Reserve System. So I thought, maybe I don't need to finish my book. So I ran down, I got a copy of the book, and I read it, and I was amazed at two things. One, I thought the history was excellent. For example, that paragraph, I can find nothing to criticize in that. That is, in my view, a perfect reading of the history. So I was impressed. How come Simon & Schuster, which is definitely in the orb of these very banking circles we're talking about, how would they dare publish a book with accurate history in it? I couldn't understand it. Go back and re-examine my premises. And then I found out when I got to the very end of the book. And that was Grider's solution to the problem. Having demonstrated that the Federal Reserve was created against the public interest, it was designed for that, has always served that function, what was his solution? To abolish the Fed? No, not necessary. Well, how about a complete remake? No, he said, that's not necessary. Grider's solution was, well, we've learned along the way, we've made a lot of mistakes, but we've learned as we've gone. Now what we need is just wiser men to run it. You get it?
Fell off the track yesterday.
You see, this, I put this in here because it doesn't directly relate to the Federal Reserve, but it relates to something that's important, and that is controlled opposition. The Federal Reserve has always controlled its own opposition from the day it was started, from the day it was promoted to the American people. In fact, the Federal Reserve Act itself was its own opposition, you see. It's an important fact that the American people must understand, that the elitists who are trying to run our lives are very good at leading and creating and funding their own opposition. What good does it do to know the history and the true intention of the Fed if you don't change it? You see? Very important fact. Okay. Second point. Was self-capitalization replaced by bank credit? Oh, of course. Everybody's in debt now. Nobody saves their own money. The interest rates are always being depressed so low as to lure people away from personal savings and into the banks. Boy, at those interest rates, man would be a fool not to buy to borrow money at those rates. And they just draw everybody into the banks and into debt. Credit cards and low interest rates. And the average person is not sophisticated to realize that this is a big, juicy worm on a hook. And they grab at it every time. Today, many businesses pay more to the banks every quarter in interest on their loans than they pay in dividends to the owners of their stock. I would say the Federal Reserve gets an A on second objective. And what about passing losses on to the taxpayers in the interest of helping the people? Well, I hear the snickers and the laugh. You all, in this audience, you're easy. But let me just remind you that there's a long history of this. I'll just pick a few. The Penn Central Railroad was bailed out in 1970. No, that's a mistaken statement. The railroad wasn't bailed out. The banks that loaned the money to the railroads were bailed out. See, the railroad was not able to pay its loan, and so everybody said, well, let's save the railroad. But what they were really saving was the bank, which was going to go bankrupt if all their loans went bad. So they bailed out the bank behind Penn Central Railroad in 1970. They bailed out the banks behind loans to Lockheed in 1970. They bailed out Commonwealth Bank directly in Detroit in 1972. They bailed out the banks that were on the hook for loans to New York City in 1975. They bailed out the banks that were behind loans to Chrysler in 1978. They bailed out directly the First Pennsylvania Bank in 1980. They bailed out Continental Illinois Bank in 1982. And now they're bailing out all banks in 2008. And where do you suppose that money is coming from? It's coming out of thin air, which means it's coming out of your purchasing power. No, it's not thin air at all. They're taking it right out of your pockets. And there's not one person in 1,000 that has any inkling that they're paying for this in any way. So, yes, the Federal Reserve System gets an A+ on its report card once we understand what its true objectives really were. All right, we're pushing to the end now. Let's talk very briefly about usury. Historically, in biblical times, a usury was a phrase to describe any interest on any loan. It was considered to be immoral. And in those days, people were expected to help their friends and their families by just giving them the money on the basis of a personal promise that they will repay it if they can. Very little money was loaned on that basis. But for someone to say, well, we'll do it on condition that you pay us 3% or 5% or anything, that was considered to be unethical or immoral, against God's word, actually. In today's world, that's not our definition of usury. Most people would consider that if you have worked hard for your money and you've saved it, and you've foregone the privilege or the joy of spending your own money, and then you lend it to somebody or give it to somebody for their venture, you're taking a risk and you've made a sacrifice, and for that, most people would say today, you're entitled to a reasonable return or payment of some kind. Call it what you will, interest, return, recognition, what have you, fee. The Muslims call it a fee. They don't believe in interest, but they charge fees. Okay? And most people would say that's it's fair. But ladies and gentlemen, what do we think about money that was not earned, was not saved, there was no risk, there was nothing given up, it was created out of thin air? Now that is a whole horse of a different color. Thomas Edison said, people who will not turn a shovel full of dirt on the project, nor contribute a pound of materials, will collect more money than will the people who will supply all the materials and do all the work. I won't bore you with the details, but I checked him out. I got my calculator out and he was right. I did a simple calculation for a $100,000 house, and I deducted all the expenses for land and brokerage fees and building materials and all that sort of thing. I punched it out, 20% down, 10% loan, 30 years interest would be, interest on this $100,000 house would be $172,741, which is about 2.5 times greater than the money spent for those who did all the labor and provided all the materials. That is usury. Not because it's excessive, because if that money had been saved and risked, it would be reasonable. But that money was created out of thin air. And so I believe that it's time for modern man to come up with a new definition of the word usury, and my suggestion is that usury should be defined as any interest on any fiat money, which means money created out of thin air. Now that example of 2.5 times more money going to the magicians than to the workers is just a pebble of sand on the beach. That was one little $100,000 house. You can't even find them that cheap anymore. Multiply that equation for every dollar that's in circulation. Remember, all of it, absolutely all of it, comes from loans. If all the loans were paid back, there wouldn't be 1 penny left in circulation. It would all disappear back into the bank vaults and back into the ink wells and back into the computer chips. All money today is based on loans, which means it is earning interest on this kind of a ratio. All of this buildings, all of the homes in America, all the cars in America, this hotel, all the factories, all the machines, all the farms, the farm equipment, the seeds that go into the ground, buses, airplanes, airports, microphones, podiums, everything is being purchased with money which is earning interest, unearned interest to these people. And once you get your brain around it, it's just staggering. It's absolutely staggering. First time I did that, I had this mental picture of this huge river of gold. It's so far from one side to the other, I couldn't even think across it. And I said, this river is flowing somewhere. I think I'll follow it and see where it goes. I thought it was going to go to the rich people, you know, like Rockefeller and the Rothschilds. And indeed, it does go there, but it doesn't stay there. That was the amazing thing. They don't use that money to buy more yachts or bigger palaces to live in or jet airplanes or Jekyll Islands. They spend that money. They don't need any more money. They've got so much already. After a man or a woman has everything they could possibly want in the material way, what is left to stimulate their imagination? It's power, isn't it? Yes. And that is exactly what we're dealing with here. This money is not being used to create more wealth, but to accumulate power over human beings, over you and me and every human on this planet. They're using this money to buy the loyalties and the obedience of their servants. They're putting people in key positions here and there. The power centers of society, you folks have heard me talk about that before. Those little groups, not so little some of them, but people belong to organizations and groups and they follow their leaders. Political parties are a prime example. There's just a few people at the top that can lead millions of people at the grassroots level. This is where their money is going. That's where their gold is flowing, is to make sure that the people at the tops of these power centers of society are the right people and are loyal to them. They're buying up the world through the loyalties of people. They're passing the money through and getting in return control. It's not just wealth. It's power. You look around the world and you can see the same thing happening in the third world countries, and some of them not so third world too, but that's a good example. Every once in a while you think, you come across a newspaper article on page 14 and it says, well, Congress voted today to appropriate another $42 billion to help the poor underprivileged people in the third world. And you look at that and say, oh, well, that sounds like a lot of money, but I don't know how much that is. I guess, anyway, we're helping people, right? So it must be good. Boy, I got a Brooklyn Bridge I want to sell you if you fall for that. What does that mean, that article? It means that somebody has just authorized another huge amount of money to go to the political leaders of some country or a group of countries, and those political leaders will use that money to solidify their control over their population and to make their dictatorships more efficient. They will use that money to buy military. They will use that money to feed and reward their friends and punish their enemies. They will open up prisons with that money. That's where the money goes. And these third world countries, one by one over the years, have been purchased lock, stock, and barrel with some of this river of gold that we're talking about. We all know that the unfortunate welfare families in our own country are so sad because after the second or third generation of children being born into welfare, they're born into a welfare culture where they haven't any concept of making it on their own. They think that society owes them a support. They can't work. They don't have the mindset. They're lost. Countries are like that too. Some of these third world countries haven't the foggiest idea of how to run an economy or how to be prosperous on their own. They get checks every now and then from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or directly from Uncle Sam. That's how they operate. They're not interested and wouldn't know how to create an economy of their own. So what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen, is this river of gold has been used to buy up the leaders of these countries all around the world, and they're just as happy as they can be with that arrangement. They live very well, thank you, as long as they can go to the United Nations in New York and have their Waldorf Astoria suites and drive around in limousines and have their palaces and their concubines and all of that sort of thing. They're happy as they can be. This is the reality, and all of this is part of the Federal Reserve story. All right. What can we do about it? Well, any suggestions? It's a big problem, isn't it? One thing we know is that we cannot slay the creature, which, by the way, we must slay the creature. That's the answer, but how? We cannot do it if we focus only on the creature, because the creature has siblings. It's not the only one out there. And you know about some of the others. You know about all of them. I'll mention just a few. I jotted them down here. They all hunt. They feed together. An income tax designed to eliminate the middle class. A school system that brainwashes instead of educates. A controlled media that corrupts the news. Controlled political parties that create the illusion of participating in our own political destiny. The United Nations rapidly dismantling our national sovereignty. A garrison state being built up around us in the name of anti-terrorism, to name just a few. FDA, yes, thank you. They're all siblings, and they hunt and feed together, and we have to look at them all, and they must all be destroyed. All right. How do we slay the creature and his siblings? Well, the simplistic answer is it has to be done in Congress, right? That's how we got them in most cases. Their laws, like the Federal Reserve Act, was passed through Congress. So we have to unpass them. How? Well, now we get down to the nitty-gritties. Some people will say, well, write a letter to your congressman. My gosh, folks, the congressmen are the problem in most cases. They know what's going on, even though they pretend they don't. Or if they don't have the whole picture, they don't care. They're like those tin-horn dictators in the third world countries. As long as they're living well, that's all they care about. We have to replace that whole crew in Washington. And nothing short is going to solve this problem. And how do we do that? All right, now we're down to it. Now, I'm completely out of time, but as Paymon said, I was going to mention something toward the end about Freedom Force. So I'll just say this much about Freedom Force. Did you pass our little sheets around, Joan? Oh, they're going around now. Freedom Force is an organization, this will take about 2 minutes. Freedom Force is an organization which was founded in 2002, didn't really get up to speed till about 2005. And we have members now in 58 countries. This is a worldwide problem. Everybody's got a similar problem. And the mission is to recapture control of the power centers of society. It's as simple as that. We've lost our freedom because we've lost control of the organizations that represent us. And we're down here at the bottom carrying our placards and saying, Oh, you can't do that. Isn't this terrible? We've never had the thought that we ourselves should reach for power. We're always on the outside of the halls of power, banging on the glass. Oh, you in there that makes things happen, won't you please listen to us, read our letters, look at our petitions, won't you please follow the Constitution, won't you do what is right, please? You know? No, that's not going to work. We have to do in a similar way what they did, not using the ethics they did, but using high ethics. We ourselves have to get up off of our couches and out into the public where the people are, into the organizations where they already are, and become influential and active in them, and gradually become leaders of society in that fashion. 1% or less of the population can lead the whole nation in that kind of a structure. How do I know? Because our enemies have done it. That's what they do. If you have any questions of how this can be reversed, just go study the Council on Foreign Relations and you get the whole picture right there. 4,000 people in America are running the whole show. Can we do that? Yes. Will it happen by the next election? No. Bad news. But it will happen. That's the main thing. If people get all focused on the next election, well, if we can't turn it around in 2008, give up. No, no, no. Our enemies have been working on this for 100 years. This whole plan was started at the turn of the century, and they have the long view of history. And unless we too have the long view of history, we're never going to turn it around. So if you really want to make a difference in the world, and you're ready for the real solutions and not just the flash in the pan and the campaign type of thing where you carry placards and feel real good, if you really want to capture control of the system again and are willing to spend some time and effort on it, Freedom Force is for you. So look us up. If you've signed that little sheet that went around, you'll receive some emails and you'll get links where you can learn more about it. And then finally, Payman asked me to comment on where I think the economy is going, or what? How did you phrase that, Payman? You wanted me to, where's it going? Well, anybody here have any doubts? It's going south. And I don't mean to Georgia. What's happening before our eyes is finally the fruition of these policies. I hate to say this, but everything that's happening now, I predicted when I first published the book. And that's what, 15 years ago. And it's all coming to fruition. It's not because I'm so smart, it's just because I know what these guys are doing, and I also know it's not the first time in history. So, you know, you hold up the template here, this is the historical template, and you read the daily newspaper over here, and my gosh, it's the same. You don't have to be too bright to figure out what's happening. The American dollar, in my opinion, will continue to go south. It'll continue to be devalued. Actually, it's just catching up with where it should have been a long time ago. I'll comment on that very briefly. You know, the Federal Reserve has been creating money out of nothing at a tremendous rate for so many years. It was at first very puzzling to me, how come inflation wasn't greater? And then I finally figured it out. It was, I don't know what took me so long, but it's what they call euro dollars. The world, believe it or not, most of the nations of the world are in worse shape than the United States in terms of their economic systems. Their money is even more fiat, it's even more worthless. Little countries in South America, and Latin America, and Asia, and Africa, some of them in Europe, they don't want their own dollars because they're losing value even faster than the American dollar was, not anymore. So they wanted American dollars. Some of those countries couldn't even conduct a reasonable financial transaction in terms of their local currency. It just didn't work. So they wanted American dollars, and they grabbed up as many as the Federal Reserve System could create. And countries like China and some of the Arab nations were just investing in U.S. bonds, and they thought that was a great thing. So all of this money was going overseas. And now what's happening is that the tide is turning. And all of this money that's over there, called euro dollars, that it's not just in Europe, people are beginning to say, I don't want this stuff anymore, so what are they going to do with it? They'll send it back. They'll come back and say, we'll buy anything we can with it while it still has any value at all. So they'll buy our refrigerators, our cars, and our real estate, and our corporations, and our politicians, or whatever they can with the money while they can. And meanwhile, we'll be left holding the bag, in my opinion, with a huge, huge inflation on our hands. That's not the end of the line. I believe that the people that are making this happen or allowing it to happen have anticipated this move. This is not hitting them by surprise. They knew this was going to come, and they're ready for it. I believe what they want to do is use this as an excuse to bring in a new regional money called the AMERO, which will be a huge step in the direction of their New World Order plans, which will be the merger of the United States with Mexico and Canada. The two legs of sovereignty, the strongest legs, are the nation's money supply and the other one being the nation's military. And the people in Washington today are doing their best to get rid of both. And so the time may come in the not too distant future when we will be told that help has arrived. These worthless things called US dollars at last are going to be exchanged for something of real value called the AMERO. So everybody will be so grateful that they now have a regional currency that they think will be worth something, and it'll be no different than the US dollar. It'll be a complete fiat currency, and it'll be another one of those appearances of the fourth kind. Finally, after that, how far I don't know, but maybe another 20 years or 10 years, then all of the regional currencies, and there'll be one for North America, one for Latin America, one for Asia, and one for Africa, and one for Europe, of course, which they already have. They will all be merged into a true global currency, and that'll be the final step. Now, will it turn out that way? Not if we have anything to say about it, but we have to know that that is the plan. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed, for a very informative speech. And folks, I hope that looks like from everybody standing, you were happy with the speech also? Yeah? Let's give Ed another hand. And so, folks, before you step out, though, I want to mention that we do have copies of Ed Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, available at the display table there, and other great works of Ed, who has several. So before you go, stop by and take a look at the table at Griffin, because his staff and him are not available today, and they will not be here tomorrow, probably. We have some of their material here, but here's a copy of The Creature from Jekyll Island. As you can see, very thick documentation. So please take advantage of getting the material and the books of audio CDs of Ed Griffin at this time, if you like. But I want to mention something else, because I've been talking to Ed about this issue for a while now. I had him on my radio program last year and this year a couple times, and we talked about the AMERO coming and things like that. This is not news to those people who follow all this. And as he said, unfortunately, collectively, we all will be hurt by what the bankers are doing. There's no question about it. But, as I said always in Freedom Law School, same thing with the IRS and income tax, or traffic tickets, or bureaucrats harassing you. Besides the collective action that we can do, the other thing I think we can do is individually, we get much wiser, much sharper, much better strategy on what to do, so hopefully we can beat them. I mean, I hate to give this comparison, but there were two guys in the middle of the jungle, and all of a sudden they noticed that about 50 feet away, a powerful big male lion is coming toward them. And the first guy says, "Oh, gosh, we're done. We're history." And the other guy starts running fast. The other guy runs after him. Second guy said, the one that said we're history, said, "What's the point of running so fast? Because he's so much faster than us. He's going to get us anyhow." And the second one said, well, all I gotta do is run faster than you. Because the lion's gonna catch the first guy and the second one's gonna go free. And I hate to sound so, direct about it, but unfortunately, as you heard, not one in 1,000 person understands this Federal Reserve System very well and what to do about it. And as he described to you, it's because of, a lot of it because of their ignorance, their lack of interest. We advertise these events and other speakers that we have here to a large numbers of people out there who heard about it, but only a few of you who chose to be here in person or listen to this on CD or video took the time to be here. And the fact of the matter is, if you understand the game and how it works, there are also opportunities created in there for those who understand to minimize the damage and even profit by it. Somebody is going to profit by this, besides the bankers. Not billions and billions and trillions like the bankers going to make, but thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or a few millions even, could be made relatively easy by an average person, depending where you're at. You're at the minimum wage level or over $100,000 level you make a year. Going to be a little different area, but you can still be ahead of the game. So that's why I want to let you know that if you want to be the one that comes ahead of all this, if you have other things planned, you may want to rearrange it to be there with us this Monday in the class that I'm going to teach on how to prosper in the coming hard times. If you understand what's going on and what to do about it, you can be ahead. Some of you already signed up to be there, folks, and you've seen by the kind of information we put out with our speakers and our material at Freedom Law School, we don't sell, we don't provide just useless information. This is all documented, verifiable information that will be useful to use. Useful information you're after, and that's what we want to give you. So I hope that those of you who have not signed up for the class Monday be with us, because we need more of you to profit from these hard times, more of you to be ahead, because the freedom movement needs people like you to become more prosperous and wealthy, because you are the backbone of the freedom movement. If it wasn't for the generosity of those of you who are here and who've donated to us before, to make these events happen, we couldn't do it. Okay? These conferences are not paid in full by your donations, but we pay at the door, but it's supported by donations of our students who believe in the work that we do. So we want to empower you to become as prosperous as possible, so you can do the freedom works that we are doing at Freedom Law School. Freedom Force International do it, folks. You can donate and have us grow powerfully together on our way to freedom. So it's a critical part of our path to freedom that you do what you can for you to become as intelligent and wise about the economic and monetary system, how to fix your job, your business, your investments, so you can be as powerful and prosperous as possible, to be able to give back not just to your family, which obviously you want to do naturally, but also to the freedom movement, to have us become free once again. So with that, I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, with Ted Gunnarsson and Eric Schein. And Monday morning, the class is 9 to 5 as well. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.